Napa Valley, world-renowned for its wines, its sun-kissed vineyards, and its legacy of pioneers. But beneath the beauty and beneath the vines lies a history few remember, and fewer still have told. Shadows of forgotten hands linger in the soil, their stories buried deeper than the roots they once tended. Whispers of an unseen past echo through cellar walls and winding trails. What was lost in time may yet be uncovered in truth.
So one of the questions I get asked is like, well, why did I write this book, right? How did this become such an important topic? And it's interesting. I was in a history program. I was doing a bucket list kind of master's in history program several years ago. And one of the classes I took was the history of U.S.-China relations, just because it was interesting and something I think is important to know. And during the class, we had to write a paper, and we were talking about a lot of larger geopolitical issues, and I thought it'd be interesting to talk about something local. And I went and I did some initial searching, and I just on a whim said, oh, were there any Chinese in the Napa Valley? Because I grew up in Napa and I thought that might be kind of interesting. I found one article on the St. Helena Historical Society website talking about the Chinese working in the vineyards in the late 1880s. And this perplexed me because I grew up in Napa. Schools, I did elementary school, junior high, high school, and in third grade, we learned about local history. And it's a pretty solid story. We learned about the Native Americans and what they contributed, and then we learned about the missions and the Spanish coming in, and then the other Europeans, George C. Yount, and so on coming in, the Italians coming, and the wine industry and so on. And the Chinese were not mentioned. And so I thought this was kind of perplexing, and so I dug in a little bit more, and there was enough to say, oh, this might be an interesting paper. Because it turned out not only were they in the vineyards, they were the dominant labor force in the vineyards, and as well as mining and leatherworking and so many other industries. And I kept digging and digging. I realized there's more than a paper here because there weren't any books or anything else written about it. And there weren't any artifacts or any evidence of it throughout the current Napa Valley's towns of Napa, St. Helena, or Calistoga. So I decided I would do my thesis on it. And I started writing the thesis, and this is right when COVID hit. And as I'm writing the thesis, I am seeing this kind of wave of anti-Asian hate kind of bubble up throughout the country. And like many people, I was frustrated. It's like, oh my goodness, what can, I just wanted to do something to kind of counter that narrative. And I realized the story of a truly American story about this group that, despite incredible odds, was very successful and really left an enduring legacy that had been forgotten, the Chinese, the Napa Valley. And so I decided to write a book and try to tell the story such that the school children today in Napa would learn about the contributions. It doesn't really diminish the contributions of the Native Americans or the missionaries, or George C. Yount, or any of the others, but it really added to the overall tapestry. And we can try to figure out why was it gone, right? How was it whitewashed, either intentionally or unintentionally? How did this happen? And that was the purpose of the book.
Now we begin to tell the story that history nearly erased, a story of strength and sacrifice, of a community whose hands shaped the very foundation of Napa's wine country, yet whose names were left behind. Beneath the success and beauty lies a deeper truth, waiting to be unearthed. This is a journey into forgotten lives, hidden legacies, and the enduring spirit of those who labored in silence. This is Chinese in Napa Valley, the forgotten community that built wine country. In the decades after the gold rush, Chinese immigrants helped build California's railroads, farms, and vineyards. Yet as their labor shaped the land, prejudice grew. Racist beliefs spread through towns and newspapers, casting suspicion on those whose only wish was to work and belong. Laws soon followed. The Page Act of 1875, the California State Constitution of 1879, and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 were meant to limit a people, even as the nation depended on their hands. This is the story of those times, and of the emigrants who endured, who contributed, and who succeeded despite the barriers set against them.
So if we look at Napa Valley today, it's an amazing economic engine. There's over 500 wineries. There's $12 billion of economic output that comes from the Napa Valley. But of course, it wasn't always that way. The commercial wine industry in particular started in the 1870s. And it turns out that between 1870 and the early 1900s, a vast majority of the labor force that was on the wine in the vineyards cultivating the grapes were Chinese. And not only were they there in the vineyards, but they were there in the mines, they were there in the laundromats, they were there as domestic servants in tanneries and so on, worked on the railroads. They were throughout the Napa Valley. But in the early 1900s, the presence of the Chinese was almost completely wiped off. They were gone and supplanted by other immigrant groups like the Italians, the Swiss, the Germans, and so on. And by the late 1900s, any evidence of their contributions was completely gone.
So my mother was born in San Francisco in 1906. Her father was born in a store on Grand Avenue, which was called DuPont Guy then. His father came to California in 1866 to work on the Central Pacific, the Transcontinental Railroad. So his name was Lee Wong Sang. Her maiden name is Lee. And so I have that oral history of coming to Gamsan. It was for work, it was for labor. And that's the history of most of the Chinese in America. They came to work, and that's why they came to Napa Valley. I mean, Napa Valley was developed by Chinese labor, like most of the valleys in California.
So I think one of the interesting things to think about is why the Chinese were here at all. And we really have the confluence of two major forces. One is we had this influx of Chinese laborers from really the mid-1800s, and the Chinese initially came here to California for the same reason that people from the East Coast of the United States or Europe or really all around the world came to California, which was gold. So many Chinese came to California to try to strike it rich in the late 1840s, early 1850s. They stayed, some were successful, some went on to do some other things through the 50s, but then in the 1860s, we had the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, the need for laborers, and so over almost 12,000 Chinese laborers were specifically recruited from Hong Kong to come work on the railroad. And they did that, and they did enormous engineering effort. They would blast through the mountains of the Sierra Nevada to build the tracks to make it eventually meet up with the westbound track coming in from the Midwest. And of course, in 1869, we had the Golden Spike hit in Promontory Point, Utah, which connected East Coast and West Coast of the United States. Now, many of the Chinese continued to work on all the other subsidiary railroads that had to happen around this area, but many more started working in agriculture. Because with the opening of California and the West, agriculture really became the major business in California. And this is for many reasons, many of the reasons are true today. Land was very expensive. So it was expensive to buy land. The cost of capital to raise money was expensive because this was the frontier. It was expensive to advertise your goods. It was expensive to transport your goods from the West Coast to the East Coast. And so all the agribusiness owners, there were many factors they couldn't control, but one factor they could control was the cost of labor. And so you have this large labor pool of Chinese who you didn't have to pay as much as the white labor force, and they ended up becoming really the dominant labor force in agriculture in California.
So my great-grandfather, Zhu Zhou, his Chinese name was Zhu Sung, but like a lot of Chinese who came to California, they were called different things by the Caucasians, like Joe Chinaman or Charlie Chinaman or John Chinaman, and he got the nickname of Joe, and so basically he decided that would be his official name in America. So that's how his name became Zhu Zhou. But he was born in Sun Wei, in Sangong Village in Sun Wei County in the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong province in southern China. And like a lot of Chinese there was a lot of poverty during the time, and he grew up poor, very poor, dirt poor. As a child, he lived in a chicken coop because there wasn't enough room in his house. And he decided at the age of 18 that he needed to leave and make a living for himself because there wasn't really much opportunities there in the village. He had heard stories of a lot of the Chinese from the village men had left for the Transcontinental Railroad and to America, and some of them had come back. So America was called Gold Mountain, and the idea was that if you left China, there was opportunity there in America to make a living and then possibly to come back later on. So he made his way to Hong Kong, and being an enterprising guy, he basically, at 18, got a position as a cabin boy on a steamer that was going from Hong Kong to San Francisco. With further research, we discovered that was the USS Japan, which was a paddle wheeler steamer. And a lot of the Chinese were required to become credit laborers for labor contractors in America and pay off their transit fees. But he was able to basically not have to do that because he got a job. And I don't know how he got a job, but he must have sold himself pretty well and got a job on the steamer to be a servant or a cabin boy on the steamer. So his mother gave him 16 pounds of rice to defer the cost. They had to pay from their wages as a cabin boy, he had to pay the cost of food. And so to defer the cost of food, his mother gave him 16 pounds of rice, and after a month or 6-week journey to San Francisco, he had only a quarter pound left, but he was able to defer some of the costs. And during that voyage, he would tell the family later that he was able to learn some rudimentary English during that passage. He was always an enterprising guy, and so he would take opportunity to learn things. And he was illiterate in Chinese. He couldn't write Chinese, and he was illiterate throughout his life. But he was good at picking up language, so he was able to learn some English. And the Chinese were all in the steerage compartment of the boat, and the cabin boys would then go up to the first class, which were all Caucasians on top, and he was able to learn how to serve Caucasian passengers and bring them their food and learn some of the rudimentary language. So he arrived in San Francisco. There were, by the way, about 500 Chinese in steerage below in this whole journey. And when he arrived in San Francisco, and there were a lot of other also Chinese men who were interested in finding work. So when they arrived in San Francisco, they were told that the way to get work in California was to go to the Chinese Six Companies, which was a 6 companies that were a benevolent association based on the rural clan structure in China. So you would go to your clan association, and they would find work for you through Chinese labor contractors. In this case, it was in the Napa Valley and in Marysville. So he was basically sent by the 6 companies to a Chinese labor contractor in Marysville, which was his first job. And it was a vineyard. And I really didn't know that there were vineyards in Marysville, but apparently there were in 1874.
The 1870s and 1880s were really pivotal for the wine industry in the Napa Valley. In the 1860s, of course, with the Civil War and all the things going on the East Coast, a lot of the wine and champagne and such shipments from Europe and in the East Coast were interrupted and didn't really reach California and the West Coast, which gave a lot of these local vineyards a kind of a chance to experiment with not a lot of external competition. In the 1870s, they started realizing the Napa Valley would be a terrific place to grow grapes, and the small wineries started to grow and expand slowly. But in 1878, this blight called phylloxera decimated the vineyards of France, and the wine output went way down in Europe. And the local vineyards here in Napa Valley realized there was an opportunity to take advantage of, and they went on a building boom. and the number of acres under cultivation, the number of wineries exploded. The vineyard owners, there was only one source of labor that could possibly meet this demand, and this was the Chinese labor force. And so they were really instrumental in the initial explosion of wineries throughout the Napa Valley.
Basically, the Chinese and the workers and then here, and at that time, the owner for this winery, they hired more than 100, almost 200, and the laborers. They did a lot of the things, for example, planting and also digging the caves like here. And usually it will take 3 months and 100 laborers finishing this kind of tunnel. And we using this rocks from this tunnel and the build and the tasting room and winery manufacturing outside of the buildings. So that is quite amazing. And also, if we look at the outside of the buildings, we still can see some of the signs of those Chinese laborers, some little bit of ladders, and it's very interesting. Yeah.
My name is Hugh Davies, second generation proprietor here at Schramsberg Vineyards on Diamond Mountain in the Napa Valley, Northern California. Interesting spot. This winery was established in 1862 by German immigrants. So the name Schramsberg might be pronounced Schramsbeck, right? To give you a little bit of the German intonation, but Schram's Mountain. So the Schram family were among the very first to do wine in this region. And they were helped by Chinese labor. So that's part of our story today as we tell it. These caves that we're in were dug with picks and shovels by Chinese labor going back to 1860s, 1870s, potentially into 1880s. But we make traditional method sparkling wines here and store the bottles in these caves that were dug all those decades ago, or we could say 150, 160 years ago. So pretty incredible place. You can still see evidence of the pick marks as they were tunneled out. This property was established by German immigrants, but it was the Chinese labor that joined them that really helped this property come to flourish as a vineyard property and as a winery property, but also more broadly our region. Some of the Chinese that were part of the team here would have also been involved in supporting the Schram family in terms of domestic support, helping to take care of the animals, helping to take care of the vines, helping with the cooking in the kitchen, the cleaning, etc. In fact, there's a building. I grew up here on the property, and there's a building that we always referred to as the Chinese bunkhouse, because presumably that's where the Chinese folks would have lived on the property in their own space. And again, this would have been 1860s up until probably the late 1880s, 1890s, right in that time period. But interesting to consider some of that unique history of this area and the contributions of a wave of immigrants from across the world. 1878
was the year that really put wines from Napa Valley and Sonoma Valley on the map. Harper's Weekly, which was a very famous weekly news magazine that was read throughout the country, decided they had heard about this new industry happening out west in California, and they sent a writer and a sketch artist to Napa and Sonoma to talk to the vineyard owners and understand what was happening in the wine industry. They wrote an article that ended up getting the Napa and Sonoma wines on the map nationally. But interestingly, the sketch artist that drew a picture that accompanied the article in Harper's Weekly showed a very active scene of wine, grapes being kind of harvested and made into wine. In the upper right corner of the picture, they showed a group of Chinese workers with their cues who were stomping on grapes with their bare feet. And this caused an enormous hue and cry throughout the country that foreign diseases were going to be introduced into the wines from Napa and Sonoma because the Chinese were stomping on them. And there was this demand and push for the vineyard owners to fire all their Chinese workers. Don't have Chinese workers working on the vineyards, hire somebody else. Now, the vineyard owners pushed back. They said, there's not going to be another labor force that can do the work for the cost and as well as the Chinese. So interestingly, the groups that were unsuccessful in pressuring the vineyard owners to fire their Chinese workers took a different tack, and they were actually responsible for getting the anti-Chinese article inserted into the California Constitution in 1879 and 1880. And the ironic thing about the whole exercise is that what was depicted in the picture never actually happened. So the Chinese were not stomping on grapes. Even at this point, the mechanization of the vineyards was much higher than stomping on grapes, and there were great presses to do all that work. The sketch artist just wanted to show an action scene, so he actually just invented the Chinese stomping on the grapes. So it's an early example of fake news that caused a little consternation.
The Chinese community goes back to the 1860s here. It was primarily a transient community that was brought in as needed as a workforce to provide basic labor for clearing of land, for grading of hillsides or flatlands, for basic construction of ditches, wells, whatever was needed. But basically an unskilled workforce, not unlike we still use today.
In addition to being successful in a variety of rural occupation, the Chinese workers were also prevalent throughout the towns of Napa, St. Helena, and Calistoga in the Napa Valley. Primarily, they were there as in the domestic sphere. They worked as domestic servants. If we think back to the 1880s and 1890s, there were not many modern conveniences for keeping up a house. So if you were a middle class or upper middle class family and you were the head of the household, if you could get a servant to help you take care of the house and take care of the kids, you did it. And what we see from the census records, especially say in downtown Napa, there were blocks where every 3 or 4 houses had a Chinese live-in servant that helped the head of the woman who was in charge of the house take care of the household. These were called China boys. No matter how old the person was, they were called a China boy. Typically at that time, you would have either an Irish girl or a Chinese man be a domestic servant. This was very common in California. And anecdotally, the Irish girls tend to be a little problematic working. They tend to talk back to the head of the household. They were interested in lots of other things, whereas the Chinese workers were, much like they were in the vineyards, were very diligent. They were committed to the work. They worked very hard, and they were highly sought after. In fact, we do know of one, the Lyman farm north of St. Helena, had a worker named Ah Hing, and he was there for decades. And we have a letter or a diary entry written by one of the sons that grew up on the farm that talked about Ah Hing and his role on the farm. He was basically the general manager. He certainly did the cooking, but he also supervised the Chinese workers that would come to the farm to work in the garden. He would make sure that the boys got their homework done on time and did their chores and so on. And in fact, the diary talks about how happy they were when Ah Hing would occasionally go back to China to visit his family, and they had a substitute worker there who was a lot easier on the boys than Ah Hing was. In fact, Ah Hing was on the farm until 1917, when in fact he eventually went back to China full-time when his eyesight was failing. But it was just one anecdote among many about the really close relationship that the Chinese domestic servants had with the families that they worked there. So it was a mutually beneficial arrangement.
In Napa, they had what they had signs saying intelligence office, which is labor contract. You come here, you want a houseboy, you send a lady of the house would not come herself. She'd send some worker to say, I need a Chinese houseboy. Actually, my grandfather was hired like that from the Market Street Chinatown. And he got a job working in a white household. That's how he learned English.
One of the other industries that the Chinese dominated in the Napa Valley was laundries. This is not surprising. Obviously, back then, it was very difficult to do your laundry at home. If you could afford it at all, you would send your laundry out to be done externally. And the Chinese had laundries in Napa, St. Helena, and Calistoga. And there would occasionally be white-owned laundries that would rise up. And in fact, we have ads in the paper that talked about white laundry. And they were not talking about getting your clothes very extra white when they did the laundry. They talked about how it was important to send your laundry to be done by a white-owned business and not a Chinese-owned business. What was happening, though, is these white laundries could not compete with the Chinese laundries and would inevitably close down, and the Chinese laundries would keep going. So the city leaders really hated the fact that the Chinese dominated this important industry and passed laws, in fact, saying that the Chinese could not operate laundries outside of Chinatown, in Napa in particular. There was a laundry owner named Sam Key who was arrested along with a couple of his workers for operating a laundry outside of Chinatown. And he was released the next day. The Chinese 6 companies arranged for a lawyer to represent him, and they challenged the law passed in Napa banning Chinese-owned laundries. That went up to a higher court. It was overturned. And in fact, that law was precedent over 18 cases throughout the country overturning Chinese-specific discriminatory laws.
Their primary community was originally scattered throughout town. They were primarily operators of wash houses, laundries as we call them today, where linens were washed and prepared and ironed and provided to retail customers. In the earliest days of Calistoga, when we had a hot springs resort here, one of the top clients of these particular wash houses would have been a visitor staying at the hot springs hotel or its cottages, who would have needed to have their laundry done routinely. And so the wash houses around town, and there were 3 of them that we know of, would have vied for that particular business. The 3 main wash houses, one that's most famous, made famous by Robert Louis Stevenson, was operated by Kong Sam Kee, which is actually depicted right here in this diorama on the main street in Calistoga. His rivals were Ah Jim, who operated a wash house on Cedar Street on the eastern side of town, and Sam Singh, who operated a wash house on Washington Street. And the 3 of them all had a lively business back in the 1870s and 1880s. Now, Kong Sam Kee is well known in literature because of Robert Louis Stevenson, our author who visited Calistoga in 1880 on his honeymoon with his wife. They lived in a ramshackle bunkhouse up on Mount St. Helena to the north of Calistoga. And his wife being quite well-to-do, they agreed that they needed some domestic labor in this crude bunkhouse. And so they were advised by the local Calistoga community that where you need to go is to one of the wash houses, which also served as an employment agency. Each one of these wash houses basically provided that service where you call upon them, say how many laborers you need, and they would arrange to provide you with workers for whatever was needed. So the Stevensons went to Kong Sam Kee, and after a whole lot of deliberation, they ended up not getting anyone to provide domestic help for them, but he immortalized their negotiations and the stories of Kong Sam Kee in his book, The Silverado Squatters. So that's a part of the story that probably we know more about the mechanics of negotiating to hire a Chinese labor force through Robert Stevenson's writings than through most other literature.
So the vineyards were not the only harvest that was intended to be used for alcoholic beverages in the Napa Valley. Hop yards, and hops, of course, being used for beer, were actually quite prevalent around St. Helena. There were 5 fairly large hop yards that were around St. Helena. And those were entirely populated by Chinese laborers. So the vineyards themselves were probably, we think, probably about 80% Chinese laborers and then 20% white laborers. Hops are grown on 10-foot poles that are planted very densely, about 1,600 per acre. And it's a fairly large capital outlay for somebody who owns a hop yard. And so for the hop yard owners, keeping the cost of labor down was especially important. And so the 5 hop yards, they were 100% Chinese labor because those were the only ones that were cheap enough to make an economic go of it. In addition to the vineyards and the hop yards, the Chinese were also active in mines. So there really wasn't any gold or silver around Napa Valley, but there was quicksilver, which is mercury. And they would mine the cinnabar, which would be melted down into mercury, which would be used for thermometers and other needs. Now, the demand wasn't as high as gold and silver, so the profit margins are quite low, which meant that, again, keeping the cost of labor low was incredibly important. And so you had quicksilver mines, which were on the kind of sides of Mount St. Helena, some of which were mixed white and Chinese laborers force, and some were 100% Chinese, like the Great Western Mine. Now, we do know a bit about the Great Western Mine because the daughter of the mine superintendent at that time wrote a book about her experiences, and she has several chapters about the Chinese that worked there and how they interacted with the family at the mine. In the late 1800s, actually Napa was almost more famous for its leather work than for wine and wine grapes. And the big one was the Sawyer Tannery in downtown Napa. And in fact, even today, you hear about Napa leather, N-A-P-P-A leather, which is a process that was actually founded here in Napa at Sawyer Tannery that makes leather very supple and very soft. And the Sawyer Tannery was primarily driven by Chinese labor. About 80% of the workforce was Chinese when it originally started. It was at the banks of the Napa River, and they actually had a dormitory that housed all the Chinese workers that worked there. So they were instrumental in this kind of major industry in downtown Napa. They were also involved in the railroads, working and supporting the railroads in Napa, as well as other businesses around town. One of the most important businesses that the Chinese did run in the Napa Valley were China stores. And a China store was like a grocery store, certainly, where it had food and tea and beverages from China that Chinese workers would shop at to have a little taste of home. But more importantly, they're really the heart of Chinatowns. They were operated by merchants, and the merchant class was distinct from kind of the laboring class. They were a special class for immigration. They were allowed to bring their families over from China that the laborers were not. And they ran the China stores that were certainly grocery stores, but they were also pharmacies, and they were post offices, and they were hostels, and they were job employment, kind of employment agencies, and they were really the heartbeat of the town. And we certainly know of several of the China store owners from the ads that they placed in the papers and from photographs. Like we have a Chanhua Jack, a picture of him and his family in front of the temple in Napa's Chinatown during a Chinese New Year parade. So they were really the leading citizens of Chinatown and ended up kind of representing the Chinese in a lot of different dealings.
He worked 6.5 days a week from sunup to sundown he told the family that initially he was paid 50 cents a day. And it was basically stoop labor, picking the grapes at that time. I think the grapes were down low, so they weren't up high like on posts like they are now. So it was stoop labor, picking grapes, clearing fields, pressing the grapes. And then he would walk back at sunset to Chinatown. So in St. Helena, in St. Helena, he would send out of that 50 cents, he was a pretty frugal guy, so out of that 50 cents a day, he was able to save enough money after even his lodging expenses and his food expenses to send money back to his family in China. And he would do that through a merchant in St. Helena's Chinatown. The merchant there knew English and Chinese and was able to transcribe dictation from my great-grandfather who would send letters back to China and money back to China.
So the Chinatowns in Napa, St. Helena, and Calistoga were really important to keep Chinese kind of culture alive. It's where a lot of the Chinese workers lived and shopped and had celebrations like Chinese New Year's celebrations. So the Chinatown in Napa was located really in the heart of downtown. And we don't have pictures, but we do have a sketch of the Chinatown along the Napa River. It was on stilts, and it would frequently flood during rainy seasons. So one of the challenges was the Chinese were not allowed to own property. And so in all the cases around the Napa Valley, there was land that was owned by white businessmen, and the Chinese would rent the spaces from the white landowners and have for their homes and their businesses. Now, each of the Chinatowns in the Napa Valley kind of operated a little bit, had a different feel. So in Napa, the Chinatown was in the heart of downtown, and it was frequented by Chinese and white residents alike. There was a lot of interest in Chinatown. Chinatown was considered a fairly exotic location. The newspapers would report on the goings-on in Chinatown. They would even send in reporters after hours to see what sort of nefarious activities are going on in Chinatown. And one of the articles that the Register sent in talked about how in nighttime in Chinatown was fairly quiet. There were people in the opium dens, there were people gambling, but the biggest thing that they noticed was all the noise coming from all the laundromats, because all the workers were working all night trying to get the laundry done for the next day. So it was a place of intense interest. The St. Helena Chinatown was a little bit different. That was set up south of town, so it wasn't integrated into the town itself. It was actually set up by a man named John Gillum, who was a local businessman, who saw an opportunity and purchased a plot of land south of St. Helena next to the railroad tracks, where he would actually lease out the land to Chinese, who would then build homes and businesses in town. In Napa, we see a lot of evidence of the Chinese living throughout Napa. Certainly downtown Napa, there were a lot of Chinese living in apartments and in the homes of white residents as domestic servants. In St. Helena, they were fairly constricted into Chinatown itself. And this was an issue because many of them were single men because they were laborers and were not allowed to bring in their wives or their families. And so you had this fairly large area full of kind of shacks that were serving as homes and other kinds of businesses, and a bunch of single men kind of living there. And so there were lots of comments about the odors and the general dilapidation. And then while initially it was fairly separate from the town, as St. Helena grew, the borders of the town of St. Helena started to encroach pretty closely into Chinatown. And there started being a lot of complaints from St. Helena citizens that Chinatown was an eyesore. And in fact, when visitors were coming up valley, up north to visit St. Helena and Calistoga, Chinatown was the first thing they saw before they hit into the town proper. So there was a lot of agitation to get rid of Chinatown. So they pressured John Gillum, who the owner, to try to evict the Chinese and return Chinatown to the citizens of St. Helena. John Gillum refused. He said it was a large portion of his net worth. He just couldn't get rid of all the rent that was coming in, and there's nothing he could do about it. Well, in 1886, really at kind of the height of the Chinese economic power, a group of anti-Chinese business owners got together, pooled their money, and purchased the land from John Gillum with the intention of evicting the Chinese that were living there. There was an article in the St. Helena Star extolling the virtues of this, the fact that they were going to be rid of the Chinese in their midst. The new landowners tried to tell the Chinese living there that they needed to go. It turned out, however, that the Chinese living there had actually signed leases that either had no expiration date or an expiration date far in the future with John Gillum, and they refused to leave. The new landowners took the Chinese to court. It went through the courts for years and years and years. They never got any satisfaction about that. The Chinese never left, and through all that time, they never ended up paying rent either. So the new landowners kind of got a raw end of the stick there. In Calistoga, it was a smaller Chinatown, and it was really centered on the railroad. So we don't have a picture unfortunately, of that Chinatown, but we do have maps, and we have a nice diorama that was done, that was currently at the Sharpstein Museum in Calistoga, that shows the Chinatown, which was several small buildings just on the other side of the railroad tracks next to the train depot. The depot is still there, the Chinatown is not. The Calistoga Chinatown was literally on the wrong side of the tracks. It was opposite from the train depot, with the railroad tracks going right between the depot and Chinatown. Clearly a very loud place to have your homes. But there were businesses and homes right there in Chinatown, and many of the workers not only worked in the local vineyards and so on, but they also worked on the railroad itself.
You know, one of my father's friends, when I was interviewing him, he said, "If you've seen one Chinatown, you've seen them all." And I go, "That sounds racist," you know. But he's saying, no. The Chinatown, you have to have the temple. You have to have the temple where the children go to Chinese school.
In the early 1880s, as growing sentiment against the Chinese communities grew leading up to the Chinese Exclusion Acts, there was increasing community pressure to move these different businesses to a centralized location, namely a Chinatown. So in 1881, two local businessmen, one being our justice of the peace, formed a partnership and purchased a small parcel of land on the eastern side of our railroad tracks. This diorama depicts our railroad depot, and it clearly shows these buildings on the eastern side towards me that are Calistoga's Chinatown. The Chinese community at first was quite resistant to move to this site, even though it was offered to them, I'm sure for a very reasonable lease. But over the years of the 1880s, gradually, one by one, each business gravitated towards our Chinatown. So by the 1890s, the Chinatown was very well established. Most of the wash houses had closed down, and all of the operations were conducted here.
Even though the Chinese were here and very successful at laboring, especially in the agriculture markets, they faced significant discrimination at the national, state, and local level. At the national level, the biggest issue was the infamous 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And what this did, it prohibited any Chinese laborer from immigrating to the United States. And this is the first act passed by Congress ever that prohibited immigration by a specific racial group.
In the spring of 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, signed by President Chester A. Arthur. It not only halted Chinese immigration for 10 years, it also declared Chinese immigrants ineligible for citizenship, a designation later applied to other Asian groups. This clause made them perpetual outsiders in the eyes of the law, which made it easier to erase their contributions from America's historical narrative for generations.
Whereas, in the opinion of the government of the United States, the coming of Chinese laborers to this country endangers the good order of certain localities within the territory thereof. Therefore, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that from and after the expiration of 90 days next after the passage of this act, and until the expiration of 10 years next after the passage of this act, the coming of Chinese laborers to the United States be, and the same is hereby, suspended. And during such suspension it shall not be lawful for any Chinese laborer to come, or having so come after the expiration of said 90 days to remain within the United States.
So really the spigot which was going, there was significant immigration right until 1882, and then it turned off, and there was no Chinese really immigration since then. At the state level, California got a new constitution in 1879 that was ratified in 1880, and it actually had a specific article in that constitution titled Chinese. And it talked about how Chinese were a scourge that were not really wanted in California, and the Chinese were prohibited from working in corporations, for government. Now locally, as far as we can tell, the people in the Napa, St. Helena, Calistoga were not especially discriminatory against the Chinese, but they had prevalent attitudes of the time. And certainly there was a fairly large anti-Chinese sentiment around people who felt that the Chinese were taking jobs that would otherwise be used for or performed by kind of the white labor force. So what we see in the 1880s and 1890s is a rise of anti-Chinese sentiment kind of throughout the Napa Valley. This is undoubtedly due to their greater population and their greater presence in a variety of industries around Napa, and also they're going on strike and probably asking for higher wages. If we can look at even the newspaper articles, and we can see from 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, the tone of the articles changed from kind of being curious that the Chinese in our midst and what they would do to the feel of the town, to really strident Chinese must go, we must get rid of them articles in the 1880s and early 1890s. So the newspapers were at least the owners were very stridently anti-Chinese. Interestingly, we would see letters coming in from citizens, however, that would actually talk about how really positive the experience of the Chinese workers were and how important they were for the community. But in addition to kind of the economic argument, we also can see a set of articles that were about kind of the moral hazard of the Chinese in their midst. They would talk about the rise of the gambling halls and the opium dens in Chinatowns in particular. Those were called out significantly, frequently, about how it was kind of ruining the moral character of the youth.
And then after that, he left to go to St. Helena. And one of the questions was, why did he leave? And at that time, it apparently was a really, the beginning of really anti-Chinese hate. And Marysville was sort of the center of it initially. During this period of time, but he thought he left the anti-Chinese violence when he went to St. Helena, but actually he sort of went into the fire again. And during the time when he started working in St. Helena, there was again anti-Chinese agitation. This was basically from working class Caucasian people who felt that the Chinese were taking their jobs and creating a depression. So anyway, he would tell the family that while he was here in St. Helena, he was attacked by groups of what he called them were no-gooders, and they would beat him up. And he had a scar all his life on his right eyebrow and a broken finger on his left hand from being assaulted. And my grandfather would ask him, "Well, did you fight back?" And he said, "No, I can't fight back because the laws here in the United States wouldn't let other Chinese testify for me, and it would be my word against their word, and I would lose." And so he decided he couldn't fight back, but he was afraid for his life, especially having left Marysville where people were shot and things like that. So he developed a habit of sleeping at night with a cleaver behind his pillow there, and he got a 44 Colt and had it loaded and hanging on his bedpost. And it was a family. It was a habit that he had all the way until he became wealthy and didn't have to have all this stuff. But he would sleep he built a big house for his family, but he would end up sleeping in a small wooden shack with a dirt floor, even though he had a lot of money and he didn't have to live that way. But he would keep his gun and his cleaver near him.
There was a significant rise in the anti-Chinese sentiment in the 1880s and 1890s. And what we see really by the late 1890s and the 1900s, the presence of the Chinese in the population is starting to drop dramatically. This is due to really two key factors. One is demographics, because the laboring class, the vast majority of the Chinese here, were not allowed to bring in their families. And so they didn't have any of their wives and their children. And there were very few Chinese women around Napa at the time. There's a lot of talk about the 1882 Exclusion Act as really the law that prohibited immigration from China. But there was a prior act that was passed by Congress in 1875 called the Page Act. And that was targeted at Chinese women.
The Page Act of 1875 was the first anti-Chinese immigration act. And what it was the rationale behind it was going to stop the entry of immoral Chinese women. And the statement was, we didn't know any Chinese women that weren't immoral. They would corrupt the, young men, and they also were a detriment to our society, So the Page Act really stopped the entry, and therefore, the Chinese laborers had no possibility of sending for their wives or going back and bringing one, So that was actually the first major exclusion law against the Chinese. It was to prevent Chinese from having a foothold in America, from having families.
So ostensibly it was about women of ill repute, but its intention was, or its execution was, that effectively it prohibited almost all Chinese women from legally immigrating into the country. And the purpose was, from the kind of U.S. kind of general policy perspective, is it might have been okay begrudgingly to have laborers come in and help solve our labor shortage to make sure agriculture in California and other places grew as quickly as possible. But we didn't want the Chinese staying here. We didn't want them to settle down, raise family, and be here for a generation. You wanted them to come in, do some work, and then go back to China. And so when you didn't have the women here to marry and raise families, it was much more likely that the Chinese men would then go back when they were done with their useful working lives, and that is what we saw. So really, 1890s, 1900s, the population of China of the Chinese in Napa went way, way down, and then really by the 1910s, 1920s, there were almost no Chinese left. At the same time, while this was happening, we started getting a wave of additional immigrant groups that were coming into Napa and really took the place of the Chinese population. The Italians came in the 1900s and 1910s and supplanted much of the work that the Chinese were doing. And in particular with the wineries, when we look at the early 1900s, you started getting the initial impetus of prohibition, and the demand for wine started to drop. And what you saw is some of the early wineries went bankrupt and had to close down. Well, the Italian immigrants came in, and unlike the Chinese, they were allowed to own property. And so you have these extended families, many of which had experience with the wine industry back in the native country. They would come in, they could purchase the bankrupt vineyards, and they could actually have their families come in and take it over and really grow. And this is where we kind of get the background or the ethos of the Italian winemaker in the Napa Valley. So they were kind of in this second wave. So the reaction to the book, and I think the acknowledgement of the contributions of the Chinese in Napa Valley has been really gratifying. We actually have now several monuments and commemorations that have gone up throughout Napa Valley talking about the contributions of the Chinese. Here in downtown Napa, we've got a plaque that's was put up by the city of Napa with privately raised funds overlooking where Chinatown was located back in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, and talking about the contributions. In St. Helena, there's actually a monument in the cemetery that talks about and lists out the names of all the Chinese that were buried there at the time.
And we raised enough money in order to pay to erect this beautiful monument here with all of the names on it. And it was dedicated in 2024 with the appropriate ceremonies and the priests and the traditional Chinese ceremony for burial.
In addition, the local school districts have talked about adding the story of the contributions of the Chinese to Napa Valley to the local curriculum so that the school children growing up today will learn about the contributions of the Chinese to the Napa Valley in addition to the contributions of the Native Americans, the Spanish, and the Europeans. And so it really is gratifying that the story of the Chinese is really American success story, doing what we want everybody to do, which is come to America, make a better life for yourself. The legacy that they have with the success of Napa and Napa Valley and for generations will be remembered.
Once forgotten, their story is now remembered. The Chinese in Napa Valley built the foundations of wine country, and though history tried to erase them, their legacy endures. In today's world, as immigrants again face division and doubt, their journey reminds us of resilience, of contribution, of triumph. For too long, this history was hidden in the shadows of the vineyards. By bringing it into the open, we not only honor those who came before, but also inspire those who come next. The struggles of the past echo in today's debates, but the achievements of these immigrants prove a greater truth, that America's strength has always been shaped by those who arrived with hope, determination, and the will to succeed. By teaching this history to the next generation, we shine a light on the path they cleared, one of hard work, perseverance, and the promise that in America, success belongs to all who help build it. This is not just their story, it is our story.